Stop falling for Canadian beer. The country that sells itself as a brewing paradise has been lying to you for decades. 8 of the most famous Canadian beer brands are nothing but corn syrup, rice filler, and hockey commercials dressed up as craftsmanship. And the worst part, Americans keep buying them thinking they're getting something better than domestic. Here's what Molson Coors and Labatt don't want you to figure out. Most of these beers cost pennies to brew, rely on the same cheap adjunct grains as the worst American macros, and spend more on one Stanley Cup ad than they do improving a recipe in an entire decade. Number 1 is so shamelessly overrated, it might be the single biggest fraud in North American brewing history. But not every Canadian beer is a scam. 3 brands still brew with real ingredients, actual technique, and genuine flavor that puts the pretenders to shame. Today, we're exposing the 8 Canadian beers robbing you blind and revealing 3 that actually earn your money. Coming in at number 8, Labatt Blue, Canada's so-called flagship beer, and honestly the most boring ambassador any country has ever sent across a border. Labatt Blue markets itself as the taste of Canada. Pour it into a glass, and what you actually get is the taste of absolutely nothing. Thin, pale straw gold with a head that vanishes faster than your interest. The flavor profile peaks at faint cereal grain sweetness, a whisper of something that might be hops if you concentrate hard enough, and a watery finish that evaporates before your tongue can even register an opinion. There is nothing offensive here. There is also nothing worth remembering. Here's the part that should change how you look at this beer forever. Labatt is owned by Anheuser-Busch InBev, the largest beer corporation on the planet. The same conglomerate that makes Bud Light, Natural Ice, and every other mass-produced adjunct lager Americans already know is mediocre. Labatt Blue isn't a proud Canadian tradition anymore. It's a line item on a Belgian-Brazilian multinational's spreadsheet, brewed to the same cost-cutting formula as everything else in the AB InBev portfolio. You're paying an import premium for a beer that shares DNA with the cheapest macros on American shelves. Labatt Blue isn't the worst beer on this list, but it might be the most overcharged. And trust me, the beers ahead of it are going to make this look like a bargain by comparison, because the real offenders charge even more for even less. At number 7, Sleeman Honey Brown. And this one is a masterclass in how a single word on a label can separate you from your money. The word honey does incredible work here. It conjures images of artisanal brewing, natural sweetness, maybe some beekeeper in Ontario carefully drizzling golden honey into a copper kettle. The reality is nothing like that. Sleeman Honey Brown is a mass-produced lager with trace amounts of honey flavoring that contribute virtually nothing to the actual taste. One sip and you get thin malt sweetness, a vague caramel note, and a finish so short it borders on non-existent. The honey is a ghost. It shows up on the label and nowhere else. What most people don't know is that Sleeman was acquired by Sapporo Breweries of Japan in 2006. So that small-town Ontario craft story on the packaging is doing heavy lifting for a brand owned by one of Asia's largest beer conglomerates. The brewery runs at industrial scale, optimizing for consistency and volume, not flavor innovation. You're paying $9 to $12 for a 6-pack of average lager with a honey gimmick that professional brewers call one of the oldest tricks in marketing. Real honey ales use substantial amounts of actual honey during fermentation, which creates distinct floral complexity and a drier finish as the yeast consumes the honey sugars. Sleeman Honey Brown does none of that. It's a costume, not a recipe. And if you think a little label deception is bad, wait until you see how deep the dishonesty goes with the brands still climbing this list. At number 6, Moosehead Lager, the last major independently owned Canadian brewery, and honestly, that fact is doing all the heavy lifting because the beer certainly isn't. Moosehead loves to promote its independence, family-owned since 1867, Canada's oldest independent brewery, and look, that heritage is genuinely impressive. But heritage doesn't change what's in the glass, and what's in the glass is a thoroughly unremarkable pale lager that tastes like it stopped trying somewhere around 1985. Light gold, thin-bodied, faint grain sweetness, mild bitterness that arrives late and leaves early, and a finish cleaner than a hospital hallway. Not because of skill, but because there's simply nothing there to linger. The independent story creates a halo effect that protects Moosehead from the criticism it deserves. People feel good buying it because they're supporting a family business instead of a multinational, and that's a fine reason to feel good. But it's not a reason to pretend the beer is better than it is. At $8 to $11 a 6-pack, Moosehead delivers the same adjunct lager experience you can get from brands costing $3 less. The moose on the label has more personality than the liquid behind it. Moosehead proves that independence alone doesn't guarantee quality. It just guarantees a better story. And stories don't improve your Saturday night. But don't get too comfortable. The brands ahead are about to show you what real disappointment looks like when it comes wrapped in Canadian pride. At number 5, Alexander Keith's India Pale Ale. And calling this beer an IPA might be the most generous use of the term in brewing history. Real India Pale Ales are defined by hop-forward bitterness, citrus or pine aromatics, and a bold, assertive character that announces itself from the first sip. Alexander Keith's delivers none of that. What you actually get is a mild, slightly sweet golden lager that tastes closer to a cream ale than anything resembling an IPA. The hop presence is so faint it might as well be rumor. There's no citrus, no pine, no resin, no bite, just inoffensive malt sweetness with a clean, forgettable finish that disappears before you can form an opinion. This matters because the IPA label lets Keith's charge $10 to $13 a six-pack, craft-adjacent pricing for a beer that is definitively not craft and barely qualifies as the style it claims to be. The brand, owned by Labatt and therefore by AB InBev, has been called out repeatedly by beer communities for what amounts to style fraud. On Canadian beer forums, the running joke is that Keith's IPA stands for "it's practically an ale" because calling it a real IPA insults every actual IPA on the shelf. In the Maritimes, Keith's rides decades of regional loyalty and the heritage of Alexander Keith himself, a genuine brewing legend from the 1800s. But the beer being sold under his name today would be unrecognizable to him. It's a corporate lager wearing a dead man's reputation. And at this price, you're funding the costume, not the craft. The beers above this are even worse offenders, and number 1 is going to make Keith's look almost forgivable. At number 4, Rickard's Red, the beer that proves you can fool an entire country by adding caramel coloring and calling it character. Rickard's Red pours a deep amber that looks absolutely beautiful in the glass. Rich, inviting, promising malt complexity and robust flavor. Take a sip and every one of those promises shatters. Behind that gorgeous color lies a thin, mildly sweet beer with negligible malt depth, almost no hop balance, and a finish so brief it feels like the beer gave up halfway through. The color is doing 90% of the work. Your eyes say craft ale, your tongue says tinted lager. And here's the part that should genuinely anger you. Rickard's is wholly owned and produced by Molson Coors. This isn't a small red ale producer that got acquired. Rickard's was created by Molson as a crafty-looking brand designed from day one to capture drinkers willing to pay more for something that looks artisanal. Every element of the branding, the heritage font, the deep red color, the word red promising boldness, is engineered to create a perception the beer itself can't deliver. At $10 to $13 a six-pack, you're paying a 40% premium over Molson Canadian for a beer that is functionally similar with food coloring and better packaging. Professional brewers point to Rickard's Red as a textbook case of how macro breweries use visual cues to manufacture perceived quality. Real red ales achieve their color through specialty malts like Crystal, Munich, or roasted barley, which contribute toffee, biscuit, and caramel flavors naturally. Rickard's skips the hard work and reaches for the shortcut. If this level of cynicism bothers you, brace yourself. The top 3 are where Canadian brewing drops all pretense. At number 3, Molson Canadian, the beer that wraps itself in the flag and dares you to criticize it. Molson Canadian has spent decades and hundreds of millions of dollars fusing its brand identity with Canadian patriotism so completely that criticizing the beer feels almost unpatriotic. The I Am Canadian campaign, the hockey sponsorships, the maple leaf branding, all designed to make you associate this lager with national pride rather than evaluate what's actually in the glass. And what's in the glass is profoundly average. Thin gold, fizzy carbonation, faint grain sweetness, and a clean but utterly characterless finish. It tastes like a beer designed by committee to offend absolutely no one and excite absolutely no one. Here's what the patriotic advertising doesn't mention. Molson merged with Coors in 2005, creating Molson Coors, now one of the largest multinational brewing conglomerates on earth, with headquarters in Chicago. The beer marketed as the soul of Canada is run from Illinois. The recipe has been quietly optimized for cost over decades, leaning heavier on adjunct grains and lighter on the traditional all-malt brewing that once gave Canadian lagers their reputation. For $8 to $11 a six-pack, you're buying a flag wrapped around a forgettable beer. Meanwhile, the 3 safe beers we'll reveal shortly deliver actual Canadian brewing character for comparable prices without needing a Super Bowl commercial to convince you they're worth drinking. But first, we still have 2 more offenders, and number 1 is going to fundamentally change how you look at Canadian beer forever. At number 2, Kokanee, the beer that hides behind a glacier and hopes you won't notice what's missing. Kokanee's entire brand identity is built on the Rocky Mountain glacial water story. Pure mountain streams, crisp glacier freshness, the perfect beer forged by nature itself. It's one of the most effective geographic branding campaigns in Canadian brewing, and it has almost nothing to do with what the beer actually tastes like. Pour a kokanee and you get ultra pale gold, aggressive carbonation, the faintest possible suggestion of grain, and a finish so clean it borders on clinical. Not clean like well brewed, clean like sterile, clean like nothing was there to begin with. Kokanee is produced by Labatt, which means it's another AB InBev product wearing regional clothing. The Glacier water story creates an emotional connection that bypasses your taste buds entirely. You're not evaluating the beer. You're evaluating the mountain on the can. And that mountain is doing a heroic amount of work because the liquid behind it is one of the thinnest, most flavor-stripped lagers in the Canadian market. Here's what real brewers know. Water source matters far less than grain bill, yeast selection, hop timing, and fermentation control. Glacier water is a marketing ingredient, not a brewing advantage. Any competent brewery can adjust their water chemistry to match any profile they want. Kokanee's Glacier isn't making the beer better. It's making the advertising better. And at $8 to $11, you're paying mountain pricing for flatland beer. But even Kokanee's Glacier illusion can't prepare you for the audacity of number one. The beer that sits at the top of this list earned that spot not because it's the worst tasting, but because it represents the most successful con in Canadian brewing history. And at number one, Molson Export. The single most overrated Canadian beer ever brewed and the most shameless example of selling heritage instead of quality. Molson Export has been around since 1903, over a century of brewing history. In Quebec, ordering an X is practically a cultural institution, a rite of passage handed down through generations. And Molson has exploited that loyalty ruthlessly. Because the beer you're drinking today as Molson Export bears almost no resemblance to the ale that originally earned that reputation. What once was a legitimate top-fermented export ale has been quietly reformulated over decades into a bland, adjunct-heavy lager that shares more DNA with Molson Canadian than with its own history. Pour it and you'll see a standard pale gold with moderate carbonation and average head retention. The flavor delivers mild grain sweetness, a trace of something that might generously be called malt character, and a slightly fuller body than Canadian, which is the lowest bar imaginable. The finish is clean to the point of emptiness. Nothing about this beer justifies the legendary status it holds in Quebec drinking culture. It persists because people are drinking the memory, not the beer. Here's the part that makes Export the most overrated Canadian beer in existence. Molson charges a premium over Canadian for what amounts to a marginally different recipe from the same production line. The heritage is real. The tradition is real. The beer is a ghost of what it once was. Industry insiders have documented how macro breweries systematically reformulate heritage brands to cut costs while maintaining the emotional connection that prevents consumers from noticing. Export is the textbook case. The name does all the work. The beer shows up and collects the paycheck. For $9 to $12 a six-pack, you're funding nostalgia, not quality. And in a country with genuinely excellent craft brewers doing extraordinary work, pouring money into Molson Export is an insult to your taste buds and your wallet. But don't lose hope, because not every Canadian beer is a corporate mirage. 3 brands still brew with integrity, and they're about to restore your faith in what Canadian beer can actually be. Unibrew La Fin du Monde. Unibrew. La Fin du Monde is the bottle that completely shatters everything you just heard about Canadian beer, and honestly, it might be the most impressive beer brewed anywhere in North America. This is a Belgian-style triple brewed in Chambly, Quebec, and it has been embarrassing so-called premium imports since 1994. Pour it into a glass and you immediately see the difference. Hazy gold with a thick, persistent white head that clings to the glass like it belongs there. The aroma hits with layers of spicy clove, ripe banana, citrus peel, and honeyed malt. Complexity that most Canadian macros couldn't achieve if you gave them another century to try. At 9% ABV, La Fin du Monde delivers a creamy, full body with flavors of dried fruit, pepper spice, bread crust, and a warming finish that lingers with genuine depth. The yeast does extraordinary work here, creating the same style of character that Trappist monks spend lifetimes perfecting in Belgian abbey breweries. Multiple international competitions have awarded La Fin du Monde gold medals, and it consistently ranks among the top Belgian-style beers produced outside Belgium. At $10 to $13 for a 4-pack, every sip delivers more craftsmanship than an entire case of Molson Canadian. This is proof that when Canadian brewers actually care about what goes into the glass, the results are world-class. Steam Whistle Pilsner. Steam Whistle Pilsner is the beer that proves you don't need gimmicks, adjuncts, or a billion-dollar ad budget to brew something genuinely excellent. Here's what makes Steam Whistle rare in Canadian brewing. They make one beer, that's it, one Pilsner. No seasonal rotations, no limited releases, no honey-infused cash grabs. Every resource, every dollar, every hour of attention goes into making a single beer as good as it can possibly be, and you taste that obsession immediately. Steam Whistle uses only 4 ingredients: spring water, malted barley, hops, and yeast. No corn, no rice, no adjuncts of any kind. It's brewed following the German Reinheitsgebot purity law, the same standard that has governed Bavarian brewing since 1516. Pour it, and you get brilliant gold with a fluffy white head, fresh grassy hop aroma, clean biscuity malt, and a crisp, dry finish with enough hop bitterness to keep your palate interested without overwhelming it. This is what a properly brewed lager actually tastes like when nobody cuts corners. At $10 to $12 a six-pack, roughly the same price as Molson Canadian or Kokanee, Steam Whistle delivers genuine European-style Pilsner quality. No corporate parent company pulling strings, no cost optimization stripping flavor, just 4 ingredients, one obsessive recipe, and a brewery that cares more about what goes into the glass than what goes on the billboard. This is the beer that makes every macro on this list look like the fraud it is. Dieu du ciel péché mortel. And at number 1, the beer that doesn't just win this list, it redefines what you thought Canadian brewing was capable of. Dieu du ciel péché mortel. The name translates to mortal sin, and once you taste it, you'll understand why this beer has achieved cult status among serious beer drinkers worldwide. Péché Mortel is an imperial coffee stout brewed in Montreal with fair trade espresso, and it consistently ranks among the top stouts on the planet. Not the top Canadian stouts, the top stouts period. Rate Beer, Beer Advocate, and Untapped users have scored this beer in the upper 99th percentile for years, placing it alongside legendary stouts that cost 2 or 3 times as much. Pour it and you're greeted with jet black liquid topped with a mocha-colored head that smells like a freshly brewed espresso crossed with dark chocolate and roasted malt. At 9.5% ABV, the first sip is a revelation. Rich, velvety coffee dominates the front, supported by dark chocolate, molasses, vanilla, and a subtle bourbon-like warmth that develops as the beer opens up in the glass. The body is thick, almost chewy, with an espresso bitterness on the finish that balances the sweetness perfectly and keeps you reaching for another sip. This is a beer that craft enthusiasts line up for. Bottles get traded internationally. Beer tourists visit Montreal specifically to try it on tap at the Dieu du Ciel Brew Pub on Laurier Avenue. And at $14 to $17 for a 4-pack, it costs less than a single pour at most craft bars. For the price of one 12-pack of Molson Export, you could buy a 4-pack of Péché Mortel and experience something that the entire Molson Coors Corporation, with all its billions, has never come close to producing. This is Canadian brewing at its absolute peak. No adjuncts, no shortcuts, no nationalism disguised as quality. Just a small Montreal brewery making one of the greatest stouts on earth and letting the beer speak for itself. 8 overrated Canadian beers exposed, and 3 hidden gems that prove this country can still brew world-class beer when corporations aren't involved. If this video saved you from wasting money on glacier marketing and maple leaf nostalgia, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling us which Canadian beer fooled you the longest, and go spend that money on a 4-pack of Péché Mortel instead of a 12-pack of corporate lies.